Welcome to episode number 2 of Conversations for the End. Today's guest is Elliott Morgan. Elliott is a comedian, content creator, and scholar of depth psychology. He's currently studying his PhD at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California. He's one of the original members of the popular YouTube channel SourceFed and the founder of Valley Folk, which is a crowd-sourced production company. He co-hosts a fundamentalist podcast which explores modern culture through the lens of psychoanalytic theory, philosophy, and depth psychology. He has 2 papers published currently, one on ufology and the religious function, and the other on the mythical underpinnings in far-right internet subculture. I absolutely love Elliott. It was really fun to speak to him. It's so cool to speak to someone who is not only a very talented academic scholar, but also who is extremely funny, extremely pleasant, and yeah, it's a good time. So if you're listening on the audio platforms, then feel free to watch this on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can go over to the Instagram where we have lots of other content too. Like, subscribe, go outside, have some fun, call your mum. I don't know, it's up to you, but I hope you enjoy. So here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, Elliott Morgan. Elliott Morgan.
What up, dude?
How's it going?
It's going pretty well, man. Happy Saturday from Los Angeles. So it's a beautiful day here. It's not raining, which is nice, which means the dog isn't tracking stuff in. It's not as disgusting. Pretty cool stuff.
That's good. And I assume nothing is on fire currently?
Not that I'm aware of. We'll see. But it all looks pretty clear. It looks like there's snow on the mountains over there. So yeah, could be worse for sure. Thankfully, everyone's safe now.
Good. Well, thanks for coming on the show. So let's jump into it. What I love about your papers is when you talk about Jungian ideas, you have this really brilliant way of bringing in your own story, your own narrative, your life into the papers. And it got me thinking about Jung's concept of personal myth and how he thought discovering one's personal myth was kind of the task of tasks and place some sort of importance on that. I was just hoping you could maybe tell us a little bit about your personal myth, and how you feel like that's developed over time, how you began to notice it, and things like that.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, it's a big question, dude. It gives me a lot of headaches because I sit there and I intellectualize it and I'm like, I don't freaking know. But I mean, when I look at, I guess, my life in a forcing myself to be as narcissistic as possible. I went to therapy for after I got divorced in my mid-20s, and I started going to therapy every week, and then I would do meditation classes with this gaggle of older Jewish women and in the valley, and it was one of those moments where life had just completely fallen apart in every possible way. And then I would just go year after year, I would go to therapy, and repeatedly my therapist would be like, you need to be more narcissistic. So I will try to be narcissistic as much as possible during this hour, if that's okay. So this is going to be me.
I mean, that's kind of what we're here for, man.
It's give the people what they want.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely trickster informed. I think I grew up in a very laughter filled house. I grew up during something called the Holy Laughter Revival at a charismatic kind of Pentecostal church in Florida, where this pastor would go around and put anointing oil on your head, and I would pass out laughing for like an hour, which, you know, in hindsight was kind of weird, but also I'm very thankful for like having that kind of weirdness in my childhood. And then I discovered performance and doing theater, and that was like my outlet as a kid. Was never into sports. Then after high school, I went and did science because I was like, I gotta be like, I want to know more than just this, and I didn't think you could make a living in entertainment at all. So I decided to be a veterinarian. And then after that, I was like, no, I feel called to go to LA and see if I can make anything happen there. And so I moved out and very quickly got, you know, to be a part of this like internet thing, and then kind of left that. Then the divorce happened. Then I started this like sketch company, and then that kind of blew up. So I think there's been a lot of like banana peels and pratfalls that I've done throughout life. So some kind of wounded trickster, but I don't really like the word wounded, dude. But I think that might be the trickster part. It's like, I'm not wounded is like, I get weird around that word because I'm like, I don't feel that way. But when I look at my experiences, there's been so many punctuations of just like, oh, everything, I have to rethink everything now. And like, I need to like figure out what's going on in here, that there is this like sort of repetitive, almost like cyclical self-sabotage thing that would happen. And then lo and behold, when you find depth psychology, and I got into, you know, started learning about the idea of archetypes and these repeated behaviors, the trickster being an archetype or a way of talking about behavior, a mode of consciousness, self-sabotage is a big part of it. So it was sort of like a lot of my, I think, past few years has been making that stuff more conscious, so that it isn't so much operating in the background or in the wings waiting to trip me up. So I don't know if that's an answer or not, and I don't know if Jung would approve of it, but that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I mean, Jung didn't approve of a lot of things, and then would contradict himself a lot anyway. So we can not worry about that.
Nah. Who would?
So, yeah, the thing that springs to mind in regards to the personal myth is this idea that Susan Rowland has when she talks about sort of how do we understand what Jung meant by personal myth in as either a paper or a book chapter, one of them. And she has this idea that I loved, which is repetition with a difference. And I think it's a literary, initially drawn from that literary term. But she says if you look at it in your life, it's kind of this idea that the archetypal patterns, you know, those regular sort of themes of your life will show up again and again, but with this different historical particularity over the top. And I guess you've touched on that there.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of first of all, Susan Rowland is brilliant. I want to shout out her because she's amazing. And she actually taught, she was my professor for a class called Jung in Context, which was really interesting because it kind of gave, I mean, obviously context to Jung. But that was just a kind of mind-blowing class. And so she's amazing. But in terms of like what you're talking about, yeah, I mean, it's like a constant, it's kind of exhausting. I've gotten to the point where I'm like, you know, like growing up in a church environment and then going into balancing that with an artistic environment and then going down the science route and then learning about evolution and then going to LA, like there's been a lot of kind of the trying to metamorphosize or transform or change or like balance out things. Like I never quite feel this like, okay, I got it figured out. And only I think in my 30s have I been like, oh, that's maybe the point. Like I think, and that's informing a lot of like my dissertation work on the trickster, because it is about kind of existing in that tension and just being like, yeah, I may not feel like I ever belong in comedy, and I may not feel like I belong in depth psychology. I may not feel like I belong at the megachurch. And I think that's kind of a kind of, you know, trying to just hold that and be like, hey, let's just enjoy the fact that I'm probably, whatever I think right now, I'll probably think something very different a year from now, which is why no one should take any of my opinions seriously. We should set that up.
I mean, that's some wise advice that I think 100% of us could benefit from
Yeah.
from embodying. But yeah, I mean, it's like this sort of shape shifting nature of the trickster, right? And I feel like that's one of the things I think is really cool about you as a person.
Oh, thank you.
You're in this Jungian sphere, but you're presenting these other kind of elements to yourself that you don't often see in the Jungian sphere, with people solely academics. And yeah, it seems like that's maybe been a theme in your life, this kind of like changing, and then that acceptance of that part of
Yeah.
maybe some sort of archetype that's running through you.
Right. I think the Jungian world, I mean, I found, so after I got into Jung through like psychoanalysis and Freud first, and then like learned some stuff about Lacan. But then was just like I would read Jung, and I was like, this guy's putting to words a lot of thoughts that I've had, but he's writing 100 years ago, and that was like, okay, I'm interested in this guy, not from like so much a theoretical perspective because I didn't know anything about that at the time, but it was more like, oh yeah, this guy is like a treasure trove. And I also was looking at, I exist chronically online, and so I was seeing the way Jung is represented, and I was like, there's something off here. But even going and studying depth psychology was initiated by like, 8 different things, whether it was COVID or it was like I had tanked or felt like I had tanked my business, and like then there was like a psychedelic trip that I did, and so it all kind of coalesced into like, I'm going to go study this world. But you're right that sometimes when I'm in the Jungian like environment, there's I mean, Hillman has an essay called like Peaks and Veils where he talks about kind of the difference between spirit and soul, and there is, I think, a high level of spirit within the kind of depth psychological Jungian world. And um I think that they're right and they're ahead of me, but I'm not. I have a hard time kind of being like, but what about dick jokes? Like, what about like, can we also be like a little like irreverent about this stuff? Um, and how much that is a good thing, I have no idea.
I think it is. I mean, you got my
Thank you.
vote. You got my vote.
I'll take it.
Good. So the other thing I wanted to talk with you about, just very briefly before we move on to some of your papers, is in terms of the trickster. I think I heard you on a Jungian podcast talking about how you feel like the best jokes kind of come from something that isn't you. This like other place, this other thing, maybe. And when you're sort of writing comedy, when you're kind of performing comedy, when you're doing that part, do you find there's like a dialogue, a kind of active imagination of sorts, where you kind of, now that you're more familiar with depth psychology and that kind of thinking, is there a reverence that you try and have to the inner trickster that is simultaneously you and also maybe not you?
Definitely, I would say there's a sense of like it kind of, and I don't think it's like, I'm not trying to toot my own horn here because it really is like, just from an experiential standpoint, the way it will work is if I'm in the mode where I'm like, okay, I'm going to write just comedy and just come up with material, which I do. One of the reasons I love stand up is because it is very bare bones like that. It's just you and you coming up with jokes, and the joke structures, I think, like I'll be in the shower or something, and then it'll just be like it just comes all at once at sometimes, which, and I'm not saying these jokes are like the funniest thing, but it is like all there, and I'll be like, ah, there it is. Like it didn't feel forced, and it didn't feel, it does feel like that kind of when Jung will talk about just the complex and in analytical psychology of it being kind of a temporary override, but it is kind of just like, hey, here's a little, write that down, and then it's like, okay, I try it, and then very often it works, and that works a lot better than sitting around and being like, okay, what's funny, what will people like, and sometimes they don't like it either way, and that's fine too.
Yeah, I
But
heard.
yeah, the dialogue, I've tried the dialogue. Sorry to cut you off. I have tried it, and it's not quite as good, but I do it with journaling. I haven't tried it with the joke thing so much. However, now that I say that, when I will write screenplays or sketches or that kind of thing, then it comes out for sure. When the format for it calls for a dialogue. When it is stand up, it's just me. See, I'm nailing it. It's narcissism all the way down. So
smashed it. So it's
you're welcome.
kind of like this, getting the trickster archetype. Mercurius is helping you read lines or write lines, basically.
Yeah,
bring them into the room and.
Right, it's very helpful to have a kind of toolbox within this sort of Greek pantheon that explains this sort of like area where, dick jokes are very welcome. I mean, Hermes, I think one of the first things he does is fart on Apollo or something.
Yeah, I mean, that stuff's timeless.
Right ultimately. After he's born and he can talk, and then he's like, "I'm just a baby. I didn't steal your cat." Like that's, yeah. That when I read that, I was like, "All right, that hits home." So
cool. All right, sweet. So let's move on to UFOs.
Oh, thank God.
Flying saucers.
Most fun subject in the world.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us a little bit about, firstly, before we get sort of stuck into your paper on this, tell us a little bit about Jung's thoughts on flying saucers and how that kind of related to myth and modern myth, if you can.
Yeah, I mean, if a myth is a way of making sense of reality, Jung, I think, was spot on when he referred to flying saucers as a modern myth of things seen in the sky. I definitely think that's happening. I think that, it also demands the clarification that by myth, we don't mean untrue necessarily, or literally true for that matter. But yeah, I mean, I very much think his thoughts on UFOs in regards to them being a manifestation of the unconscious during psychologically turbulent times is still very much happening right now. And I think that it hasn't changed. And I think that the flying saucer as a symbol of wholeness is still going on. I think that all of the all of the shapes that you see in these like charts of, all the different types of UFOs that have supposedly been seen, they're all archetypal like images of some kind. Maybe more phallic than others. But I think that that's still going on. And I also think that it's a perfect like myth to erupt right now. And I like unconsciously, because it fits in with kind of the space age and our technological like obsession, and like it fits in with materialism, but it also has this kind of woo spiritual element where people are getting abducted and personally experiencing things, and then you have these sort of like spokespeople for the myth, and you're not quite sure who to trust and which ones are true believers and which ones are charlatans. And it is just like, that seems to me completely analogous to what a myth would have been, where the question of whether it's true or untrue is just sort of suspended while you're existing in it. And I think that's kind of a cool thing. Not that I also don't think that people can get way too into it, and I don't think people should necessarily get into it if they aren't into it. But for people who are, I think it serves a really good purpose. Because what's the alternative? I mean, you kind of do fundamentalist or traditional religion, which doesn't seem to be going well for traditional religion these days. I don't know if you've heard, but they're not exactly doing banger numbers right now. And I think that you can go that route, or you can go to a football game, real football, not soccer. And I don't know what you got. Do you call it soccer or football? Football, soccer?
It is football, I'm afraid.
We'll talk about this later. No, but yeah, I mean, you can get that. The whole idea, right, is there's this, for Jung and for analytical psychologists, libido is just all the kind of energy that propels you. And it flows down these kind of riverbeds that we call archetypes. Some of these riverbeds, many of them, I guess, I'm probably speaking out of pocket here, but like they something in us wants to transcend and wants to feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And I think that because of the culture that we're all kind of born into for the past few hundred years, that that riverbed becomes dammed up, and it kind of spills out into other areas. And I think that, belief in UFOs is just one of those areas. I just think it's a very like apropos way for it or thing for it to flow into. It's a container for people's sort of imagination.
Yeah, and you have that fantastic line in the paper where you say the absence of a viable container for the modern Western world.
Yeah. I mean, thanks. I do think that it is how viable it is, I'm not sure in the long run, but that is kind of what the paper is about, of being like the fantasy of disclosure that everyone talks about. I'm not sure would be great news for the people who are like the most diehard adherents. I could be wrong. I don't know. I don't know that we'll ever know. But I think that the very lack of quote unquote disclosure is what keeps the kind of scaffolding up. And I think that there's plenty of archetypal and analytical psychologists who view ufology as being kind of informed by this sort of trickster motif. Its elusiveness, it's mercurial. I mean, it's downright, like, some of the trickster elements are so on the nose that it's sort of shocking. I was reading this story about a guy. It was like a military dude, I think it was in the 50s. And he, highly respected, saw a spaceship land in his backyard. It opened, and there were like 3 small, what he said that were like almost fairy-like creatures, and one of them handed him a jug to fill with water. And he was like, why is this spaceship, they just traveled across space and they need me to fill their water? And so he fills their water jug, and then he sees that they're making pancakes in the spaceship, and they give him pancakes, and then they take off, and he tells everyone about the experience. And this dude is like not known for being, psychologically unstable or anything. The only mark that was left behind was the pancakes. And they sent the pancakes, dude, to the government, to the Department of Defense, because this dude was like, they're like, this guy is like, he's a legit dude, we're going to test the pancakes. And it turns out that the pancakes were, you're not going to believe it, totally normal pancakes, except for one thing, Chris. There was no salt. And the interesting thing about there being no salt in the pancakes is that fairies, according to Celtic tradition, can't eat salt.
Okay, so I mean,
so there's a fun fact for you. That was Jacques Vallée who made that connection, because Jacques Vallée is the one who kind of went through and did a very, like, I would say, archetypal thing of these are things that are wearing masks and presenting themselves in various ways across folklore. And the most recent one is the alien. But prior to that, it was, all of the other characters that you see. Very fun. I mean, it's just like, I don't know what to make of it, but like the fact that people's brains and people's research capabilities are able to go, hey, actually, the lack of salt, fairies, you did say they look like fairies, and fairies don't eat salt. It's like, what do you do with that? I don't know. But it is very, I mean, I don't know how anybody could not be entertained by it. So.
I was initially, as you started with that, this idea of just these like dehydrated sort of aliens coming down, and then it did take a turn with the pancake mix.
Right, it's perfect.
Okay, so I mean, I got to unpack that. I'm gonna have to unpack that after this, and
yeah, I mean, going back to the kind of the paper, but I do think that like the whole idea of any kind of transcendence is ultimately unattainable in like a sustained way. And I mean, I don't think, I think that the very nature of the phenomenon is such that I don't see anything really happening that like settles the matter. And I think that that's great.
So like once, say with like disclosure, once it becomes kind of concrete and we sort of know what the thing is, which is often the urge of many people, it loses the mystery. You can't. We need the element of mystery, the unknown, the kind of the element of the numinous that we just can't grasp and put into
Yeah, I think too,
language.
like the what was I gonna say? The with the like disclosure, like it's so unfalsifiable, like in my mind, that I think that works in the just speaking in terms of the myths, like longevity. Because I'll hear people, I'll listen to like what the UFO community will be talking about and kind of what their vibes are on everything, and who is these people that come out and they're like, we're doing psionic capabilities and summoning orbs, and they'll dismiss all of those people outright, but then they'll believe wholeheartedly people who quote unquote go under oath. But I'm like, how is like, because they're like, he can't lie, he's under oath. But I'm like, if you can say something under oath that you cannot prove that the person is lying, then you can say whatever you want, like under oath. And I think that the very fact that it's unprovable is what keeps people coming back. And that, for me, it's like the experiencers too. The commonality of what people experience is just fascinating, and the kind of like ostracization and the sort of reducing of these people's experiences is a very telling, I think, sign for where we're at right now, where people are so dismissive of subjective or phenomenological experiences. Didn't you say you're writing on Jung and phenomenology, or you're interested in that?
Yeah, I've been dipping my toe into the phenomenology in Jung.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, phenomenology is like a whole can of worms in itself, and then applying it to Jung. But there's some really great work already with Jung and phenomenology. Roger Brooke, the book Jung and Phenomenology, highly recommend
oh cool.
reading that. It's one of those books where I think when you talked about when you sort of first discovered Jung and you kind of felt things clicking a little bit. I would say I had the sort of same experience and then sort of pursued it through a couple of years. And then when I read Jung and Phenomenology, it was as if something else clicked into place. It was definitely a really pivotal book for me.
Really?
And I'm not saying Roger Brooke has sort of nailed everything, and you should take everything in that book as gospel. Read any book with read outside the text, right? But it's placing Jung's work, I think, often because of the way Jung speaks, the era that he was born into and his influences, the way he writes, it has its pros but it also has its cons. And Jung and Phenomenology by Roger Brooke kind of puts it into, obviously, phenomenology, the realm of direct experience. And all of a sudden, these things really start to like make sense in this kind of like, oh yeah, like I know what that feels like when that happens. So you start to get this sense of, yeah, I know what it's like to be possessed by an archetype. I can, in that language, he uses various different phenomenologists. There's quite a lot of like Heidegger there.
Cool. I'll check that out. I love Heidegger. Yeah. What was like? I mean, is he? I'm assuming talking about the cultural milieu of being like Jung's sort of desire to constantly be seen as an empiricist, and
yeah, and he was sort of tied to that Cartesian, metaphysics. And there's a good story in it actually about Jung in Africa when he sees. I won't dive into it too much, but he sort of has an experience. He sort of goes, this is it. This is individuation. This is what it feels like to kind of be one with the world. And then he goes back to his room, and then on the way home he has a really bad dream. Full disclosure, it's like quite a racist dream as well. So he has this bad dream, and it's kind of, that dream is assigned to him. He writes about it in Memories, that he cannot part with that Cartesian, with that European kind of metaphysics. He needs to keep that. But then later in his life, he started to let that go, I think. And things got interesting. I mean, it was always interesting, but I mean, with synchronicity and the unus mundus, it will become slightly less empirical. So one thing I also wanted to kind of touch on, when I briefly said you like Heidegger there, the idea that Jung thought that this kind of modern myth was coming about because of the turbulent times. And there's the I guess, post atom bomb was potentially the thought there. And we're talking about Jung's also being tied to that Cartesian metaphysics and Heidegger. And there's a great quote that I love from Heidegger where he's talking about the atom bomb going off. And he says, modern man, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, he says, like, modern man looks at the atom bomb and thinks he sees a sign of things to come. But what he's actually seeing is the consequence of something that has already happened. And that thing that had already happened to Heidegger was the Enlightenment and that modern materialist thinking. And the consequence of that was the atom bomb going off. That's where it led us to that point. And it was finally, turning from an idea that was kind of like, come out from the Enlightenment and then manifested in this like one pivotal moment of the atom bomb explosion. And it kind of makes me think that, with the UFOs possibly being that phenomena, that myth, that modern myth coming around this time of turbulent times, it is almost like, here's your antidote to that Enlightenment thinking. Like, it's led you here. Now a myth is being born. And like you say in the paper, it's kind of, the unconscious is like adapting with it because it is simultaneously material, but also mysterious and unknowable. That's
that kind of like inherent contradiction and paradox, which is again, motifs aligned with the trickster for sure. But the like I write in the paper, it was from another study, but it's like there's an organization called MUFON, and they're like, we do scientific, we're on the science side of UFOs. We're not doing any of that woo-woo mumbo jumbo stuff. But then this study shows that like when they do an analysis of all the like publications, or many of these publications, then the woo kind of seeps in, where like it'll be in the book reviews, it'll be in the advertisements, it'll be like it kind of slips or slithers into, no matter how much you try to stick with this nuts and bolts idea. As I think Gary Nolan said, who, I make no judgments on any of these folks, but he made a line a couple years ago that was like, the woo is right around the corner. But that sounds like something Jung could have said back in the day on synchronicity, not maybe UFOs, even though I think he thought they were connected. But it is. It's definitely both and I think that that's a very kind of fun thing. And in terms of like, we're dealing right now with maybe not atom bombs, but the threat of it is still there, and the threat of climate catastrophe, and the threat of wars and economic concerns. Countries splitting apart, or I think just down to people on a neighborly level being more distant and more suspicious of one another. Like, I was reading this article from The Atlantic a couple days ago about like, we're not even like the loneliness right now that people talk about kind of post-COVID, where like the bars still aren't full. Like, if you go out to LA, it's very rare that it's going to be hard to find a seat somewhere. And it was this article about like, it's not even that people are lonely. Like, they don't even feel the loneliness. Like, they're not aware that they are lonely, because this has become so like, so much the norm. And another one of my wonderful professors, Glenn Slater, wrote an essay that I really love called Numb. And it's sort of about like, yes, it's like there's so many potential apocalypses happening that it becomes overwhelming, and we become congealed and just kind of deadened to it. And so the symptoms of like original psychoanalysis, where Freud was dealing with hysteria and Jung was dealing with schizophrenia, then it's like we're not even displaying like the symptoms, besides numbness or detachment. And so the growing interest in something as outlandish and fantastical as the UFO world does seem like a compensatory kind of thing. Like, people are hungry for something that's going to shake them out of their malaise a little bit.
Yeah. And as you kind of point to in the paper, that desire to connect with the numinous has a shadow side to it, even in its potency. Can you just talk about that a little bit, where you see that in the culture when you wrote the paper and maybe now as things have changed? Because everything moves so quickly these
I
days.
mean, yeah, the UFO world, I think it's pretty, it comes in the form, I think, of just conspiratorial, like the unleashing of conspiratorial thinking, which that too, I would say, is a shadow of just any kind of trying to find a transcendence. Because in our culture, if you're conspiracy theories are perfect. Well, I'm saying that mostly facetiously, but like they're well poised to be that avenue for people seeking transcendence because I mean it gives you a sense of like you have control or you have the secret or like this sort of almost quasi gnostic knowledge of like, well, if you just don't know, and then you kind of get this assuredness about you, and I think it can be really bad for like relationships and families because people become obsessed with it and they become possessed by it, and it becomes the filter through which they see every aspect of life. And so I think I mean, I'm in Los Angeles, which is one of the most supposedly not religious but incredibly religious towns, because people are seeking immortality through their image and through their mushroom trips and their crystals and their horoscopes, and it's ingrained in us. And then it goes kind of back into that peaks and veils thing where then you become this sort of LA like feet are barely touching the ground because you're just like so aware of manifest. It's like that kind of new age thing can do the same thing where all of a sudden you are no one can talk to you, like you're not a human anymore. You've become on one of the peaks. So yeah, and in my experience, I try to constantly keep tumbling down the staircase, a spiral staircase, but the any kind of belief in anything I get very like ambivalent or hesitant on, which I've learned to try to embrace a little bit because I think it's my effort to not become totally like into something. Now, having grown up in around a fundamentalist environment, I can understand why I take that stance. But it goes down to like even Jungian psychology. Sometimes I'll just be like, I don't know, maybe it was just Freud. Maybe Freud had it right. Maybe Freud and Jung had it. Like constantly entertaining that I'm wrong is both exhausting, but I hope keeps me a little bit from being fanatical about any particular idea. Except synchronicities. Synchronicities, I make no concessions on.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because we all do it all the time, and you have to really catch yourself trying to, there's been points in my life, funnily enough, sort of around the time that I discovered Jung and started seeing my own myth and had to have a little sit down and be like, oh no, like this is my story. I bet sort of make this go the right way.
Yeah.
But in those moments I've seen where like I've, held a series of beliefs, and when I've looked at them, I've gone, oh, actually, I don't think I think that, like deep down, like in me, I don't think I think that. And then you have to kind of face that, and you can have these difficult moments of kind of like death and, psychological death, symbolic death, but that leads to these new, these sort of rebirths, right? In that kind of Jungian sense. So yeah, rigidity is, it is tricky to spot that. So
Trickster, yeah.
So on the subject of rigidity, I think it's kind of like a semi good way to go on to the other paper. I had a few segues for this actually. I was trying to work out. So I mean, the one I picked was from Little Green Men to Disenfranchised Young Men was the first one.
Beautiful. Love it.
Do you want to hear the others that didn't make the cut?
Please. Yes. Let's go through them. Everyone.
Okay. So another one I had earlier was From People That Love the Greys to People That Hate the Gays.
Yes. That's my favorite so far.
So, and then I think there was something that just went straight in the bin, which was like, the people who love the Spaceys to the people that hate Chad and Stacey's, or something along those lines.
Hate, loving Greys to hating gays, I think is very funny. to vote. So we should probably, yeah.
Yeah. Let's
I didn't write a
explain
paper
then.
bashing gay people in case
Yeah.
anybody's listening.
So no one clip that, all right? So
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
so yeah, it's your paper you have on kind of how you feel like certain parts of the kind of far right internet culture are kind of possessed by this like a Apollo like archetype. So if you could just elaborate some more, that would be fantastic.
yeah. I mean, it's the God bless them. They're doing their best, but I feel for them on a sincere level, specifically the young men who get kind of caught up in this stuff. And I got my start back in the day on YouTube, and there were a lot of young people that were watching me and my pals make very silly videos, and it kind of introduced me or threw me into the world of the internet in a way that I was not really familiar with. And I kind of feel like I've watched this movement of the kind of MGTOW, incel, far right influencer at times. Like there's the the kind of just traditional like conservative talking head person, and then when you go further and further it just gets more extreme until you get into your neo-Nazi alt-right, like women should just shut up and we need to go back to some imagined utopia in the 50s or whatever they think. I don't know. But the Apollonian thing is, I mean, Apollo, it's been a while since I looked at it, but it's like the cluster of symptoms would be, he far-sighted aims, god of music or god of science, god of math. Apollo and Adam I think of as being very into the naming, into segmenting everything, making sure everything is discrete and not ambivalent and not chaotic. And you can think of it as order and chaos, with chaos being closer, I guess, to like Dionysus, and then Apollo. I mean, I'm doing a disservice here to both of them, but Apollo being more order. And so you have these, just on an image level, you have these sort of, on one hand, the political pundits who get up and, debate with college students and they have all their little factoids. They have their list of things. They have their, they want to do a debate and they want to catch you in your, word. And they want to, if you didn't say quite the right, well, did you know this? Did you know? And it's very, almost clinical, and it's very for show. And I went into a myth, I think with Marcius or Marcius. Doing a program where you read a lot independently means I never know how to pronounce a lot of these words. But whatever that myth is, it's about him offending Apollo, and Apollo tricking him, and then like just destroying him and murdering him and flaying him alive. I think he like skins him and nails his skin to a tree or something. It's some horribly graphic death, because Marcius was like, I can play the lyre as good as you can, or whatever. And or no, whatever. I think Apollo has that, but basically Apollo is like, well, flip your lyre upside down and play it. And Marcius is like, I can't do that. And then he loses. And so Apollo kills him. And so now you have this whole trend of videos where it's like, so-and-so destroys social justice work, so kills social, and it just seems like the same thing of like, haha, I got you on an argument or a debate tactic. I got you on some kind of, or a gish gallop, and now I'm going to put your face in a thumbnail and say that I've destroyed you. And then people are going to watch that happen and mock you. And then it is, it's very archetypal, very like in service to a particular mode of consciousness that says, get your like chaotic pink hair, get your nose ring out of here. And not only that, we're going to profit off of it. And I'm going to make a brand off of it, even though I'm 15 years older than you. And I've had, days to think about this, and you just are walking from class to class. It's a totally unbalanced thing, just like that myth is. Then when you get into the further right area, that's where it becomes pathological, or more pathological, where these dudes are just like, they cut themselves off from the world. They cut themselves off from women. I mean, in terms of like far-sighted aims, they aren't interested in the messiness of life. And I'm not talking about people with clinical like stuff in that area. I'm talking about people who believe that women hate them, and that they just have to like take their quote unquote black pill. And so I get into another myth where It's like a black raven or something, and I forget the exact story, but taking those, it's very fun to take the kind of cultural things and then look at the myths and be like, whoa, this stuff is still playing itself out. Like when I'm in my more skeptical, cynical mode, I'm like, what's the point of this? But then you kind of go, oh man, it's just kind of, if anything, I think it shows that there's nothing new under the sun. But they're caught up in something at any rate. They're caught up in something psychological that I don't think can be treated as well with just diagnosing them or dismissing them. I think there needs to be like a way of approaching this subset of people where it is rooted in humor and like genuine brotherly love. And so I kind of compare that with the relationships of the gods and Apollo and Hermes and all that. Kind of went on a tangent there. I don't know if that's helpful.
Very helpful. Yeah, and I think it's cool that the way you kind of sign that paper off in some sense is optimistic and supportive with that kind of brotherly kind of approach, right? And it's really easy to look at that kind of behavior negatively and all get on our high horses and act like we're not fallible human beings and judge that. But
yeah, and to not excuse or condone like what they're doing or what they're believing. I mean, I think it's pretty atrocious, but I also know from my own experience, like I wasn't a big athlete and I wasn't like a Casanova. I mean, I had like one girlfriend in high school and then married her. And so it was like, I think, and maybe that's a blessing because I could see myself getting into those wormholes. And I think that the algorithms right now are so powerful that like, I don't know how young guys are doing it. And I don't know how they're able to not end up somehow funneled into that kind of content. And I think that people do a real disservice by just dismissing it or thinking that you can just kind of actively step out of it. Like it takes about one click of one video before my algorithm is like, would you like to see this insane person for a second? And maybe that's just me, but I think that I have read stories that the algorithms are such that they are funneling guys in this direction. And that too is a technological trickstery kind of deal.
Yeah, so I believe, I might be wrong, so if I'm wrong, I apologize if anyone does the research after this, but I think there's a book by Laura Bates, I think her name is. I believe she's British. The book's called Men Who Hate Women, and it's all about this kind of the various subcultures, and she talks about the internet and the algorithm and does an experiment where she kind of puts a browser as like a fresh browser, clicks on like one video where it starts as like quite tame, sort of you could discuss this kind of thinking about like masculinity quite easily, and then within like she says like 4 videos she's like already on to something that's very kind of way more extreme. And I think in the book she talks about how she has some sort of correspondence with someone who works at YouTube and how they describe how the algorithm does work. And ultimately what you have, at least I think in this book, the way she describes it is ideas are like nuance. They're obviously like sort of 3-dimensional and, you know, have all these kind of different shades to them, I guess. But then as the algorithm kind of takes that in, it just wants to get it like binary. It's just trying to turn it into like one or the other. It's taking it to the extreme so that it can feed you the content easier. It's not like sophisticated enough to like feed you nuanced content. It's like it needs to get it binary so it can feed you more content. And also, so I think I heard this on maybe Modern Wisdom this week. They were talking about the idea that it's also trying to shape you. It's trying to change your views so it's easier for it to then market content to you as well. So that's scary. It's kind of like this ominous, kind of invisible shadow, however you want to look at it, kind of pulling the strings, right, of these. It's almost, I Yeah, I wonder what the
It's
sort of
terrible.
archetype of the internet would be. Some sort of, who
Yeah,
knows?
I mean, Hillman writes about it being would be associated with Hermes in the sense of being the god of communication, but I don't know that that extends to the algorithms these days, because I think that it's like just more powerful than anyone can like. It's more powerful than any individual, and it takes an immense amount of effort to not get sucked into it. And I am not like I'm not immune, because I know that like I'm a Reddit guy, and I'll get on there, and I know that it has made me feel like I'm go, oh, this is an echo chamber, like especially after our most recent election. I was like, oh, okay, like I mean, I wasn't totally shocked. I was surprised it went as much the way it did, but um like I was like, oh, I need to like expand my online kind of variety here, because I'm being sucked into just, and it's harmless compared to some of the other ones, some of the other paths you can go down on the internet, but it is still like homogenized, and it's very like where I also was uh I do think that the internet, like when I was first coming up, and I think that, how old are you?
35.
Okay, yeah, so we're both like in the age bracket where we can remember not having the internet.
Hmm.
And then I remember having the internet and being like, this is the coolest, most free, most like, it's the Wild West. And now it's, I think, not even that. Like, we've somehow, I think, ruined the internet, where it's not even, you don't have that freedom anymore. You're being just hooked, because it's like not like an ocean you're swimming in, or if it is, they're just, it's like hooks everywhere that you, if you bite anything, you're gonna get like jerked into some whole new world, and it's scary. We just need to unplug. We need to get rid of. We need to burn it all down.
Yeah, or
Burn all the servers.
at least bring back dial-up, because you had 60 seconds of the dial-up noise, and
Yeah, and that
someone,
kind
yeah, it would make you think twice about, maybe, do I need to
of
go on
yeah.
the internet today?
Did it sound like it's something dying the entire time? But man, yeah, that sound just brings back memories of being a horny teenager, being like, okay,
Yeah,
a little bit
waiting
longer.
waiting 2 hours for a low
Yeah,
resolution JPEG to
just
download.
something. Any boob, uh,
Okay,
any
so
boob app. Yeah.
so earlier you mentioned synchronicity and how that was, hold some reverence for you. Tell me a little bit about your experience with synchronicity in your own life,
Oh,
if
fine.
you
Yeah,
can.
I didn't know what the synchronicity was for a long time, until someone in our, I think it was Valley folk, the audience was like, someone in the audience was like, that's called a synchronicity. And I was like, oh, right. I'd heard it, but I hadn't really put together like what the experience was, or what it would feel like. Um, but yeah, I mean, I've had some pretty gnarly ones. I had one where, well, the more recent ones, so doing trickster stuff, a lot of what I'm reading is like Native American mythology, and so I'm focusing on the coyote story. And I remember a couple years ago, she's fine now, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer, um, and we were waiting on the diagnosis, um, and very nervous, very uncomfortable, so I scheduled this like yard guy to come look at our yard, because I was like, this will take our mind off of it. Otherwise, we have this appointment like 2 in the afternoon. We're going to be, or 1400. And I was like, let's get our mind off of it. This guy comes, his car breaks down in our driveway. And unbeknownst to me, my wife had gotten the results online of her diagnosis. And so I'm dealing with this guy with the uh, car broken down. I'm out here in my office when he's not working, reading about coyote and reading about, him not supposed to be eating a plant, and he eats it and he's farting up into the sky, because he wasn't going to be told no by some plant. And it's a just crazy story. And then I'm trying to running out, getting this guy's car jumped. Like an hour later, we get him out, and I go back inside and I'm all proud of myself because I feel like a man. And my wife is like, so it looks like I do have it looks like I have breast cancer. And then I started to cry, and it was like a relief as well, because we're like, okay, at least we know now. She'd noticed something like a lump, probably like a month prior, so it was very much like we kind of come to terms with it, but it was like a emotional breaking point, I would say. And she gets up and she hugs me, and we're hugging for a second, and then she opens her eyes and she sees behind us a coyote that's just running around, just starts circling around the house. At that time, we hadn't seen them very often around here. And that was one of those things where I was like, whoa, that's so crazy. And then we started yelling at it. And I think it was just us taking our emotional energy out of it. And I felt bad about later yelling at it. But then throughout that experience, and thankfully, again, thank God she's doing great. But it was so weird. Like the amount of times, I think it was Saint Michael, like it would keep popping up constantly. And she's Catholic, and or was Catholic. She grew up Catholic, which is the millennial way of being Catholic. I think I don't think they're even allowed to be Catholic anymore. But it was like Saint Michael would pop up as a motif. I would be reading a book and there'd be a whole chapter all of a sudden on Saint Michael, and it would be like she would do tarot or archetype cards. I think it's like some kind of card that has these. But yeah, Saint Michael would pop up pretty much everywhere. And so that recurring thing always felt, and he's a healer and all that stuff. So it felt consistently, not even like, I mean, in terms of reverence, I kind of view synchronicities a lot as like kind of a wink, or kind of like, it's going to be okay. I take comfort in it. And I think that that's kind of the healthier way to go. Some of them, though, in the past have made me be like, is this a simulation? Like, are we living in it? Like some of the ones that are so on the nose where it is like 3 or 4 things aligned, it gets downright creepy, which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
Did I tell that story? Is that okay?
That story it was great. Yes. And I'm glad that your wife is okay.
She's doing great. Yes, she had that was a long year, and still it's just now a part of our lives. But yeah, she's doing much better, and it definitely was a long, I guess, an individuating time for sure. Because at one point my therapist was like, after I told him about it, he was like, "This is either going to make you a holy man, or you're going to be really bitter at the world and angry." And I think I landed more in the middle, maybe more toward the Holy One, not super angry anymore. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, those testing times, they are, we talk about earlier with the kind of these external phenomena kind of coming up in turbulent times. That coyote, it seems like that's when you need it, right? You need it. Just like Jung's synchronicity, the famous synchronicity story of he's stuck with this woman in sort of therapy. He can't get her to get past whatever it is that's psychologically kind of blocking her. She comes in, she talks one day about a dream she had about a scarab beetle, and then there's this sort of tapping on the window, and Jung opens the window and catches this bug that looks awfully like a scarab beetle. Obviously wasn't, but looks a lot like it. In his hand, and said, "There's your scarab beetle." And it was in that moment, wasn't it, that this woman sort of got it. She's kind of whatever it was that was kind of blocking her. Again, I'm paraphrasing the whole story, but
no, yeah, you know, she had a like overly rational outlook or something.
Yeah,
disenchanted.
And I think it's you're seeing your scarab beetle there, right? The coyote, the ties to the trickster. Again, to tie it back to the beginning, it's this sort of the repetition with a difference. It's like the archetypal pattern is appearing again and again in your life. So that's really cool. And I thank you for sharing that story. Because
no problem. One time I was studying synchronicity in our class on that, and I walked out here and there was a scarab beetle, or something like a scarab beetle, but it was dead. And I was like, there's I had that thought of you and going, "There's your scarab beetle," and it was just him going like, "There's your scarab beetle," and it's just dead. And I was like, that's funny.
Well, the coyote was alive, all right. So
The
you
coyote
know,
was alive. Yeah, they have a tendency.
everyone's
They
got.
love being alive.
My synchronicity was actually a baseball player, and this happened in LA, actually, of all places. So, I mean, I'm going to run through it really quickly because
Please,
we're sort
yeah,
of
I
near
love
the
these
end
stories.
now. But I had a somewhat numinous experience. At one stage in my life, if you sort of end of 2018, it was very profound. You know, I'd done the whole kind of psychedelics thing in my life, and
Hmm.
this was sort of without any of that. It was very out of the blue, very numinous experience, kind of at the beginning of me reading Jung. Actually, I just started reading, I think it was Psychology and Alchemy. Good one to start with, obviously.
Yeah,
Neuron Too Cryptic. And yeah, had this numinous experience and kind of had this very felt this very real archetypal presence experience of the self, this kind of numinous wholeness, kind of coming through my experience. And I
yeah.
happened to be sort of at one part slightly after this experience watching videos of Ramdas,
Hmm.
Richard Alpert, and it was famous, obviously, from the '60s with Timothy Leary, kind of
Yeah,
pioneering that psychedelic experience. And I was a bit more spiritual, kind of openly spiritual at the time, doing the yoga. Had been listening to a lot of Ramdas, so when I kind of broke it down from that Jungian standpoint, it made sense that like if I had an experience of this sort of ineffable archetype that
hmm,
can't be kind of made concrete, when it forms an image that makes sense to me, it's gonna be probably something like Ramdas because I've been
yeah,
spiritual, wise old man like figure. So I had this Ramdas, the self numinous experience, sort of was dealing with the consequences of having that experience for sort of weeks after, and decided that I was just going to go to America, go to LA. I was going to do some Kundalini yoga. I was going to walk around, do other things that you could do in California that you couldn't do in the United Kingdom at the
yeah, sure.
time. And so, yeah, got on a plane, made no plans, did not book a hotel, just wanted to see where things took me. I was trying to leave it completely up to like fate, right?
Hmm.
And that's not a wise idea because I ended up walking around LA till about 3 o'clock in the morning, not being able to find anywhere to stay, becoming genuinely quite concerned for my safety. And then all
Yeah,
of a sudden, out of the blue, there was this hotel, this tiny little hotel. I just don't know how I spotted it. It's just this little door. And I went in, and there was a man who was at the front desk, and he just was talking to the guy at the counter. He was so energized, this man. And then he started talking to me, and he said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Chris." And I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Tim Leary." And I went,
that's pretty good.
"Tim Leary." So I've obviously had this numinous experience to do with Ramdas, who was obviously famous with Timothy Leary. Meet the first guy I meet in California at the kind of salvation point in the hotel that I'm going to stay at,
Yeah,
Tim Leary. And it turns out it was Tim Leary, who was a baseball player, I think, for the LA. What's the baseball team in LA? Was it
Dodgers.
Dodgers? Yeah. So he won the World Series with,
Wow.
yeah, and he paid the deposit for my room because my card wouldn't work because I
Oh
was
my God.
so he saved me, you know? So it was very odd. It was a very weird interaction because he was so
Yeah.
energized. But Tim, if you're listening, thank you for paying for my room. Lovely human being. But yeah, very
Tim
strange.
Leary, man, he's just what doesn't that guy do? You know, baseball, psychedelic. That's an awesome one, dude. Yeah, I had one where it was archetypally similar, yes, but I'd booked a cabin to hang out with some friends, and the girl, everyone was going to Big Bear, and I'd booked a cabin for me and the girl I was dating at the time. I broke things off kind of spontaneously. It just sort of like happened one night, and I was like, this isn't really working. And I was listening to music on the way. I was like, I'm still going to go to this cabin. And I discovered this guy, this pop singer, and I really liked his song and I liked his music. And I kept playing it on the way to, and it came up on like a Spotify shuffle thing. And really poppy, like really, like I'm not like a music, connoisseur, but I woke up the next morning alone in this thing, and I'm like looking at the guy on Twitter because I'll get kind of like obsessive if I like pop artist or any music artist. And my buddy was like, "You want to go grab a beer?" And I was like, "Yes, please." And so we go and grab a beer, and we sit at the bar, and then we're like, "Oh, we'll go outside." And I go out there, and it's just the guy. It's like the guy, like it's like the dude, like the actual dude that I just discovered on Spotify, like sitting there. And I went over to him, and at first I went to my friend. I was like, I opened the Spotify. It's like halfway through his song, and I was like, "Is that?" Do you? And he's like, "Yeah." And so like I went and talked to him, and he knew who I was, and we just chatted for a little bit, and I was like, that was really weird. And then there's more elements that I don't say publicly about it, but it was one of those synchronicities that had 4 different things happen to the point that it was like even predicted me dating who I would later date, who I would later marry. But yeah, wild stuff. And the Tim Lear thing, I would pass out. I would be like, no way.
Honestly, I mean, for me, like I said, it was around that time of slowly getting into Jung, and I think that I've always looked at that since as like a message from the unconscious to be like, do you want to buy into this? Do you know what I mean? Like you say about like the wink, the kind of nod from something ineffable, something unknown. It was kind of like showing me what it could do, what reality could do. And yeah, I just don't think, had I not had that experience, I don't think I would I feel blessed that happened, because I can really buy into what Jung talks about, and I'm sure you've had those experiences yourself, like that, like the coyote. It's it's cool.
For me, it was like, I mean, I went through after my divorce, and it just became very like emo is the wrong word, but just kind of like there's nothing and it's sad and life is pointless. And like I found some old journal entries and I was like, golly, dude, lighten up. But it was through just a bunch of synchronicities at some point where it felt more irrational to not think that something was going on. Like I eventually came to the conclusion, I was like, that's great for other people. If they're like, that's just a coincidence, and they, you project meaning onto it, you want to reduce it and say like, things just happen sometimes and that's what it is. Great. I came to the conclusion that I personally, because of just the color and the vibrancy of these experiences, I just couldn't. I was like, I no longer have the option to be totally, not to totally not believe that nothing is going on, which was a very like big moment for again of being like, oh, I thought I had it figured out, and now I feel like there's definitely more to life. So it's cool.
I think that's a good place to kind of wrap this up. There's more to life. Amen. And yeah, I guess it's a lesson to realize that there is chances to be re-enchanted from the kind of material conundrum we've got ourselves in all around us every day,
and thank God for it. So amen.
So Elliott, tell us, where can people find you currently?
Well, I do a podcast with one of my best friends in the world, Dr. Peter Rollins, who is a Lacanian scholar of Lacanian psychoanalysis and a theologian. So if you would like to hear that perspective on things from a somewhat comedic point of view, I say somewhat because I'm also on the podcast. That's a very fun thing to check out. The Fundamentalists is available wherever podcasts are available. Besides that, Instagram, but it's mostly just me posting videos of my new dog. My wife and I's new dog, I should say. Yeah, and that's Elliott Morgan at Instagram. 2 L's, 2 T's.
Fantastic. There is a lot of good dog content on there, so I urge everyone to check out the podcast and check out the dog content as well. Elliott, generally, I cannot thank you enough. This has been fantastic. I can't wait to see what you do in both comedy and the sort of Jungian spheres. We've talked about it. It's fantastic. Yeah. You are a fantastic human being. So, thanks so much.
You too. This has been lovely. Thank you so much.